and welcome to the Compass PD podcast, where we dive into evidence-based practices and research-driven strategies that empower educators and leaders to make a lasting impact. I'm Dr. Stephanie Brenner, your host, alongside the fabulous Dr. Stephanie Evans. Hello, Dr. Evans.
Hi, Dr. Brenner.
I was like, oh, we're just going to call each other Stephanie and Stephanie. That might get a little bit confusing. So I'm really excited for Dr. Evans to be here today because she has a very wide range of knowledge, expertise, and interests. I really met Stephanie when we started working together as literacy coaches in our school district. And it was really interesting to me because it wasn't until a few years in our work together when her position shifted to be an instructional coach that I was totally surprised that she was willing to do PD on math for the district. That's when I realized she's very passionate and knowledgeable about math in addition to literacy. Here, all along, I thought she was just a literacy person like me. And so then all it was like, oh no, she has this incredibly in-depth knowledge of math and literacy, which I find to be really unique. Today, we are exploring one of Dr. Evans' favorite topics, and it has a really close relationship with one of my favorite topics, dyslexia. We know both of these topics are popular in many spaces. And Dr. Evans, will you please tell us the name of the topic that is one of your favorite things?
So the name of the topic we'll be talking about today is dyscalculia. It is something that when you look at the word, you may want to say dyscalculia because of the way it looks. It kind of looks like that. And you think of calculus maybe, but it is pronounced dyscalculia. So you almost do like a little Q or a coo in there when you're saying it. So with the emphasis on that middle syllable.
And that is something that I learned literally about 4 minutes ago. So I couldn't wait for her to introduce that to
Yeah.
us and to everyone. And I know I'm going to mess that up. So please just point it out and say, no, Stephanie, that is not how you say
Yeah.
this word. So no, Q,
Uh-huh.
Leah, dyscalculia. October is Dyslexia Awareness Month. Earlier this month, Dr. Hepburn and I did a podcast about dyslexia because dyslexia and dyscalculia are similar and students can have both learning disabilities. We wanted to spend more time exploring dyscalculia. Dyslexia is getting more and more attention than ever, but it's not so much the case with dyscalculia. Today, Dr. Evans is going to educate and inspire us so we can continue to support all students, especially those who have characteristics of dyscalculia. So, Dr. Evans, can you share a little bit about what got you started in this topic?
So it kind of started, honestly, it was one of those things where, because I always struggled with math. And I would always say to people my entire life, I've said to people, I feel like I just can't keep numbers in my head. Like they fall out of my head. I can't remember dates. I can't remember like certain amounts. So history, like years and things like that have always like been something I felt like I couldn't hold in my memory. And I always struggled with math. And so when I became a teacher, my strength was always ELA. And I was always like, oh, I love teaching this. I felt like I was good at teaching it. But then when it would become time for math, I felt like it was just, I was not doing a very good job of teaching it. I
Hmm.
didn't feel like my students were learning. So that's kind of where it started a little bit. But then I noticed my students and having some of the same issues that I thought I had as well. And that kind of started where I was like, there's something going on. I know there's this a math disability, but didn't really understand or ever even hear that word dyscalculia. So then, as a coach, I started working with my sped teachers and started learning more about disabilities and math disability in particular, and wanted to do some more research. And so, really started digging into the research of what in the world is this. Also, with all of our learning around dyslexia, that word dyscalculia kept coming up alongside it. And so, when that happened, I was like, okay, we need to figure this out. And so that's kind of what started my interest. So it's kind of been over the years, gradually building and building until I was like, I have got to learn more about this.
Yeah. I find it so interesting that so many educators that when they get a passion about something, it really stems from a personal aspect where like you just were really incredibly vulnerable, and thank you for sharing that your struggles sparked your interest in this, where for me, if you listen before or know anything about me, my interest in dyslexia stems from my own son having the struggles. So there's seems to be this personal connection with topics that interest educators. And then it starts becoming a school-based interest. And I just find that empowering that teachers can have a personal reason that impacts their profession. And I think it's cool that we can have that impact. What you can expect from today's episode is learning what actually is dyscalculia. Along with that, we're going to learn about some characteristics of what it is, not just like a definition, but what can we look for? We're also going to talk about what are some systems and structures that we should have in place for our students with dyscalculia. And then finally, what can educators do to encourage both parents and students who might be struggling with characteristics of dyscalculia?
Good, you're getting at saying it.
No, I feel
You
like
didn't
I'm
even pause.
fine.
You just went, ooh,
I
right through.
know. I feel like it's like I'm finally gonna get it. Lots of repetition, and it'll be good. So let's just dive right in. Dr. Evans, can you tell us what is dyscalculia?
So dyscalculia is a specific learning disability with an impairment in mathematics. And so that can affect number sense or calculations, problem solving, or all of the above. What then happens is it results in a consistent failure to achieve in mathematics. And this is regardless of age or intelligence or how much instruction or lack of instruction or even effort. So oftentimes a lot of effort is expended without a lot of results. And so there's that consistent failure that's happening. It impacts all kinds of numerical tasks, and dyscalculics are born with it. It's something that is neurological based.
Which is really similar to dyslexia. There's the neurological basis that occurs in the what's happening within the brain when those kinds of tasks are happening,
Mhm.
which is absolutely intriguing to me that
I
we
know, it's so
have these
fascinating.
things. What are some of the more common characteristics that you might see in a student who has dyscalculia?
Well, these are students who you'll see using their fingers to count even like very simple numbers. So things that we would expect that you wouldn't have to be using your fingers to count on. So say like 2 plus 3. And they're still, by third grade, they're still using their fingers to try to figure out what's 2 plus 3. So, or they may be, if they are upper grade students, they may be using tally marks to calculate things. And so when you give a problem, and even it might even be say a multiplication problem, but when you see their paper where they're showing their work, they're doing tally marks of all of the groups of things. And so even like for those basic simple tasks. You'll also note with these students that mental math is very difficult. Again, kind of goes back to what I was saying, but for my own personal experience of not being able to hold numbers in my head. It's kind of that same thing, needing to work it out on paper a lot more and not being able to do it mentally. I had mentioned earlier about how they work very hard, but often they'll do poorly on assignments and tests. So you see them putting forth so much effort, and you'll hear their parents say, we work for like 3 hours and they still are having trouble. And the teacher's doing intervention and the teacher's pulling them for a small group. And it's like nothing seems to be working, and they're still doing poorly on assignments or tests. Difficulty remembering math facts. So these will be our students, when we're like, okay, memorize those multiplication facts. That is difficult for them, or remembering the rules or procedures or those algorithms. And so you go over it and over it and over it, and it's just not sticking. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that they may, at home, you may see that they avoid playing games where keeping score is important. And so avoiding those kind of things because they have difficulty keeping score because again, holding those numbers in their head. Even things like dice, subitizing is an issue of being able to see those dot patterns or see that when those dots are arranged in a three, that means three. You'll see them like counting the dots on the dice in order to see that it's three, rather than being able to just look at it and say, oh, three, and then move 3 spaces. So when it's their turn, they'll take a long time to figure out how many spaces to move because they're not subitizing.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, and that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Also, telling time and keeping track of time, being able to use an analog clock and understanding, but really understanding the concept of time. So if you say this is going to take 20 minutes, for some students, they'd be like they could kind of understand how much time that would be. For a dyscalculic, they have trouble understanding like what exactly does 20 mean? What is the quantity 20 mean? Or the quantity 5 mean? And so that's why they have trouble keeping track of time because
Oh.
they don't understand the span or the amount of that much time. I think this kind of goes with the difficulty managing the quantities. So if you ask them to set the table, or you said, how do we have enough forks on the table for the family? And say you have 5 people in your family and they go over and they look at the table, instead of being able to just glance and say, oh yeah, we do, there's 5 forks, they would actually be 1, 2, 3, having to count the forks to see
Oh,
that there's 5. So not being able to see that quantity at a glance.
wow. That I just never thought about some of those things that at all. Like I literally just learned a ton listening to you. And I know one time before when we were talking, and it wasn't that long ago, kind of embarrassingly, I'm gonna admit this. I asked you, what does subitizing mean? Because I didn't know.
Uh-huh.
So I at first here quite honestly, a few seconds ago when you said subitizing, I'm like, wait, what was that? I know she's already told me this before. And so when you started talking about visualizing the numbers on the dice, I'm like, oh, that's what that is. Okay, thank you. Because I fully admit my knowledge is very limited. I luckily only had to teach math to first graders. So it's fascinating to hear you talk about all of those things. When you think about the characteristics of dyscalculia, why is it important for us to notice these characteristics?
Well, I think it's important as educators for sure when we have students in our classroom who are exhibiting some of these characteristics. Now, one thing to note is there's a long list of characteristics.
Right.
So when we look, we just gave a few.
Mhm.
When we look at that, is if you see, and depending on the age of the student, they could have certain ones, and you may be thinking, oh, my child has dyscalculia. Uh-oh. It's not necessarily that. It's it's a combination of some of them. And so it's mathematical learning difficulties that include a deficit in that number processing, in using the language of math and memory, visual spatial processes, or reasoning skills. And so it's kind of all of those, it could be any of those areas. And just like with dyslexia and other neurological disabilities, it can be across a spectrum or a range. And so you may have some that are, have a lot of those different areas that they're having learning difficulties with, or it might not be. So each child who has that dyscalculia has unique differences in how this deficit might present itself. And we have to kind of really think about the profile of the child we're looking at, who's in front of us,
Mhm.
when we're making considerations about do they have it or not, and then also what we would like to do to intervene. When we identify our children with these characteristics and we provide them with that support, that's where it's crucial because so they can have success in mathematics if we can identify it soon enough,
Mhm.
and be able to start to provide them with the support that they need.
Right. Just like with dyslexia, the more you know about what the characteristics are as the educator or even as the parent, the easier it is to identify those characteristics in our students and identify them with confidence. I, I think is a big thing to add there. And then start providing supports as soon as possible. So knowing the characteristics allows us to provide supports and interventions if needed.
Well, and interestingly, I think I read about 30 years behind in our research with dyscalculia versus our research in dyslexia. And so you can see how much of an impact we've made with our knowledge with dyslexia. And if we can catch up with the teacher knowledge and the understanding and being able to recognize it, what a big impact we'll start to make in with our students in math as well.
That's kind of scary to me.
I know. I know. It's very little known and not understood and not recognized. So it's and then when I saw that 30 years, I was like, oh my goodness, that is a lot. That is a
So,
long time.
so can I clarify? Is it 30 years behind the knowledge of dyslexia or 30 years behind in the total research?
Research.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're 30 years behind in the research behind, yeah,
Okay.
dyslexia, which I think is what you were asking.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because like it typically, well, what we're seeing in the research with in general, and dyslexia falls into this, it's about 20 years we can have research happening in the field and have the learning, and it takes about 20 years before that
All
is
catches
put
up.
into practice within the class.
Wow.
And so knowing that dyscalculia is even further behind with that, that's frightening.
Yes.
And
Yes, it definitely is. And
yeah,
that's why you start to, when you know all of this, you start to feel a sense of urgency and we've got to get this knowledge out there. Like that's how I start to feel.
right. And so we're so thankful and lucky and blessed that you are able to come share your expertise with us today. So I just have a follow-up question. When might teachers and parents start to notice that there's a problem with their students?
So it is sometimes difficult to determine if a student has dyscalculia. Part of that is because students and children do develop at different rates. And
Hmm.
so there is some of that time where someone just needs a little bit more time. But when you'll first start to notice it is in that early mathematics. And so you may start to notice that they start to have difficulty recognizing even small quantities and attaching the correct name and or symbol to those quantities. And so oftentimes it's not, there's difficulty with let's say there's three apples and then associating that with the number three and associating that with these three apples are the same as these three dots. Or I can make three tally marks and that is the same as these three apples. And so that kind of, you'll start to recognize that with not really grasping the idea of quantities and attaching that correct name to those quantities. Also, in the early stages, counting backwards is a challenge. And so one of the things that we ask students to do in the early is to start to counting backwards from numbers. And that is often difficult because it involves working memory, which is one of the characteristics of students with dyscalculia.
Wow. My mind's going with the connections between dyslexia and how those relate. So let's move into like the next like big purpose of today. And so that's what are the structures and systems that we should have in place for students with dyscalculia? So what is needed to set up the learning environment or just learning in general for students with dyscalculia?
One of the things that really specifically is explicit instruction. So in mathematics right now, there's kind of, it kind of reminds me sometimes of the reading wars. And it's like, which way is the best way to teach math? And is it inquiry based, problem based, or is it direct instruction? And so with our students with dyscalculia, it's that they need that direct, explicit instruction and intentional with that. And so we can pull in some of that problem solving and things like that. But in order for them, sometimes that gets too overwhelming and they need that explicit and direct instruction. Another thing that helps with our students with dyscalculia is making sure we're making the thinking and the math very visible. So using visual representations and them be helping them to see the number and what that looks like. And so using things like manipulatives and drawings and models and number lines and all of those wonderful things. And so when we think about visual representation, and with all students, we start with the concrete.
Mhm.
And students with dyscalculia, we may be staying longer in that concrete or constantly coming back to the concrete. So if I move to the abstract and I start to do algorithms for students with dyscalculia, I might have the algorithm here, but on the side, I'm showing with the manipulatives what's happening with it. So those visual representations. The other component or characteristic that can help our students with dyscalculia is student verbalization. So giving them many opportunities to talk about the math, talk and explain their thinking, and using that vocabulary. Using things like heuristics. So that would be shortcuts. Sometimes we think of like using acronyms for that, such as PEMDAS, we use to remember the order of operations. So those kind of things work really well because they help kind of free up that working memory so they can just concentrate on here's the steps.
Mhm.
And then lastly, providing ongoing feedback. When they're working through a problem, giving them immediate feedback or immediate support in the moment. So that usually, in order to do that, oftentimes that involves small group instruction or individual work, or maybe even working with a partner. So you may be noticing, Stephanie, that you're like, these are best practices.
Yes.
Which is true. And so the good thing is it's not something extra necessarily that we have to do just for these students. It's something that our best practices for all students. And when we really are intentional about these things, it really helps all students, but particularly our dyscalculated students as well.
I'm so glad to hear you say that because I really was like, oh, direct, explicit instruction that's systematic and concrete, visible manipulatives, that multi-sensory type of learning along, and the verbalization can come into that multi-sensory learning that we're allowing kids to see, talk, and like manipulate all of the things.
Mhm.
And then the heuristics, did I say that correctly?
Uh-huh.
Those little shortcuts, I still remember some of those for myself as a child. But then the idea behind that is just to free up the working memory so things become automatic and fluent.
Mhm.
And finally, the feedback, like those are the best practices. And when you just said it's good practice for every single kid,
Mhm.
but it's critical or really important for our kids who are struggling with dyscalculia. And it's the same with dyslexia, and that's the same just without any other type of learning disability. When you think about dyscalculia and supporting our students, what do you think that we forget or miss?
I think one thing is that it is not uncommon. So dyscalculia is just as prevalent as dyslexia. So you may think because you haven't heard much about it, oh, is this a new thing? Is this something new that we're diagnosing or something that's just occurring? And it's not. It's just as prevalent as dyslexia. It's estimated that 50 to 60% of people with dyslexia also have dyscalculia. So it's like a whole piece that we might be missing. So just a quick example, if you're a student that you have, you may think it's your dyslexic student, and you may think, well, they're just struggling with math because they can't read the story problems. They're just having trouble reading. When in reality, they may be having trouble reading the problem, but they also have trouble if you read the problem to them. They have trouble with the problem solving and understanding the number.
Mhm.
And so many times we think the dyslexia or the dyscalculia or the math disability or math struggles are because of the dyslexia, when in fact it could be both. It could be they have both, and it's not just they are having trouble reading the problem.
One thing you just said there to me that sticks out is they still struggle when we read the problem to them.
Mhm.
And I feel like that's a really easy instructional thing to put in place to just kind of maybe test our theories that
Yeah.
that really sticks out to me. Yeah.
Yeah. I think another thing that we forget or miss is that, or or that we might not realize, is that our students with dyscalculia are most likely not getting the support they need because of our lack of knowledge about the disorder. So I think many times we just think, and then for some reason with math, we say this more than with reading, we just say, well, they're just bad at math. And you'll hear adults say that too. And so it's not just you're bad at math or math is your weakness. It's an actual disability that once it's recognized, we could figure out some different ways to help them if we really truly understood what it was. And then the last thing I think is that sometimes we miss is that the cycle of doing the concrete, which is the manipulatives, the representational, and the abstract, going through that process must be continuous and repeated often. So I mentioned that earlier, but I think that's the thing sometimes we miss. It's one of those things like, well, we did the manipulatives, we've done that, and well, now we're here. So let's take the manipulatives away. And for dyscalculic students, they need those manipulatives there all the time for a very long time just to have it. And it might even, so having them available in your classroom where they could grab and use them whenever needed, is a big piece. And I think sometimes we often miss that, especially in the upper grades where now we're using the algorithm. It's paper pencil. We don't need that stuff right now. And we need to not withhold that. We need to make that available for them to use.
So I tend to some of the things that you are saying here just tend to like spark some emotion for me. And I'm just gonna be really honest about it. The idea that our our own knowledge is potentially holding students back because we don't know. And
Yeah.
and so our kids aren't getting the support they need because of that. And then I also think, and it's not our fault. It's not our teacher, like it's no teacher's fault that we don't
Right.
know this information. Um, but then I also think about the things that you were just saying with that idea of the cycle of needing that concrete representation all the time and continuously. And how many times I know I've done it. I think that a student should be beyond the point of needing to count. or beyond the point of needing the math fact chart with them because we're past that, or you're too old for that, or any of those things, that the kinds of things that we say or just do unintentionally, because we think we're ultimately helping the kid, but
Yeah. You think you're doing them a favor. Hmm.
yeah, but we're really not. We're
Yeah.
maybe making it worse for them, and
Hmm.
because of our lack of knowledge.
Yeah. And it's surprising that we were never given that knowledge. A lot of it's because we're so far behind in research of it. And every single teacher wants to be doing the very best they can, and they are doing the very best with what they have. And so we have to equip them with the knowledge so that they can continue to do what they do best, which is teach.
Correct.
You can
Absolutely.
only work with what you have.
And they also, teachers, do a fantastic job of meeting kids where they are and
Oh,
making
yeah.
connections and building relationships with students. And so it's so empowering to get this information out to them so that they can start doing those things sooner and our
Yeah,
kids
for sure.
benefit from it.
I like that word empowering. That's what it
Yes.
is, definitely.
Yeah. What would you say are the biggest strategies or tips for educators?
Well, I think exactly what we just said about that knowledge and understanding. As we were talking and as our listeners are listening, there may be student names coming to mind
Yeah.
and thinking, oh, this student or this student or this student. So making a mental note of students now as you're listening that have these characteristics, and then just kind of start to begin implementing some of these strategies that we've talked about. I think you're going to mention about the blog that I've written goes really in depth with those strategies and gives some examples of some things to do. And so just kind of, first of all, recognizing your students that may have this and then beginning some of those strategies to help them.
Mhm. When it comes to strategies, too, one of the things to keep in mind for educators who this information might be brand new to them is picking one strategy
Oh, that's a good idea.
and getting good at that and feeling like I can do that one instead of trying all the stuff with
Mm-hmm.
every kid all the time, because that can be so overwhelming for the teacher and the kid. So maybe just picking one or two things that you feel like you could implement in your classroom as a starting point for growing your own knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's great advice.
Okay, so we're already starting to get into this like big purpose of today, which is what can educators do for our students. So on that same train of thinking, what can educators do to encourage students and parents? So how can teachers and administrators who work with students with dyscalculia, what do you recommend? When things are hard, how can we encourage them and how can we support them?
So I think a few things. So our students with dyscalculia may have difficulty with completing work or tests. And so we can think about ways that we could have more authentic ways for them to show their work or their understanding. And so it might be, instead of having them complete a paper pencil test, maybe I'm going to pull them over and say, can you show me with these manipulatives, whatever the concept is? Or can you draw this for me? Or by making something to show their understanding. And so, for example, if we're doing volume, instead of taking the test and doing the paper pencil on volume to show me you understand it, could you build me something and then explain what the volume of it is? And also to help students keep up in class, providing those teacher notes for them, maybe videos of math demonstrations. We can front load a little bit,
Mhm.
providing them with study guides. And we talked about the manipulatives, having those on hand, and then instant access to resources. So, like those hyperlink docs, where if they're struggling with something, they could click a link and be able to see it visually right away, right
Mhm.
then. Um, So one of the things that you might not be surprised about that's very is a natural effect of dyscalculia is math anxiety. And so when students become overwhelmed or shut down and kind of start, those will be they'll start to avoid math. Like all of a sudden they have to go to the bathroom or they have to dig in their backpack for something. We can take steps to interrupt that cycle. And we can do things like providing opportunities for more multisensory work. So anytime we can do something where they can see it or they can hear it or they can physically experience it, prove it or model or explain or creatively demonstrate it would help break that cycle a little bit.
I something that I think that really strikes me, and again, I get emotional about it with the topic of dyslexia. So because they're so closely linked, it just gets my heart, is that the idea of confidence in helping every person feel like they're a reader, or you said it earlier, they are a math person. And I'm not a math person. The build their confidence of in that they are a math person. And I think that's a big idea. Um,
Yes.
I recently was with a colleague and she had a sticker on her computer that it said how to be a math person. And it literally was
Do math.
do math, be a human. And I'm like, I've done math and I am a human. I can be a math person. And here I am in my 40s and I've always
Yeah.
thought I've been a math person, but I was like, well, I could be that person. So
Well, look at me, because I just told you how much I couldn't hold numbers in my head, and now I'm a math content leader. Like it's funny how I would not, if you told me when I was crying in third grade over my time test, if you told me I would be in the position I'm in now, I'd been like, whatever, you're crazy.
it's so heartwarming and stuff. And I just love that though. Wow. You could like that would be so inspiring for you to share
Yeah.
with other students that
Yeah,
for them
yeah,
to
for
think
sure.
about um that yeah, it's hard right now, but it doesn't always have to be. It's not
You'll
always
get it.
to be.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So being an educator is one thing, but being a parent is another, and it can be really, really hard to see your student struggle, like you just said, your third grade self crying. How can we help and encourage parents?
I think it's the same thing as how empowering it is to have that knowledge. And so I think equipping yourself with the knowledge, if you see some of those characteristics that we've talked about, or some of the characteristics on the blog, and you notice them, start to advocate from your child's school. So I think that also a lot of the things we talked about can be done at home as you're thinking about some of those ways when you're helping your child with that.
Mhm.
In many cases, again, it's recognizing what it is. And so if you're seeing a lot of those characteristics, it may be, and a lot of times parents, like as a parent with my own kids, I was like, well, I wasn't good at math either. And so that's just how it is. But it's not, it doesn't have to be that way. And so we can find the tools and the support we need for our children.
Knowledge is power.
For sure.
So you've shared so much with us today, and I think I could talk to you forever about this. What are one or two key takeaways or recommendations that you would like to offer educators, parents, or anyone who might be listening today about dyscalculia?
I think one of the things is the importance of applying some of these practices and things in our everyday practice. And again, we talked about how it's good for all students. So it could be something that we're intentional about incorporating every single day in every math lesson, and it will make a big impact. Um, Again, those practices will benefit all students. And so it doesn't have to be something extra. So as we're listening to this, sometimes we put so much pressure on ourselves as teachers of, okay, now I need to do this and adding. And the good news is that it doesn't have to be something extra. Those strategies will be beneficial for all students.
I think that it's not something that has to be extra is really important for our educators to hear and also for parents to hear that it's good instructional practices and done with very strategic intentionality is
Yes,
what makes it different is that we're doing it very strategically. The things that we're doing are done very strategically.
yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Stephanie, Dr. Evans, holy moly. I honestly have 4 pages of notes. So it's crazy here. But I'm just totally impressed and blown away by your knowledge. I've learned so much, but I'm going to try to quickly recap some of the big things that you've covered today. So you've talked a lot about how supporting students with dyscalculia requires intentional, targeted strategies that address those unique learning needs, especially number sense, I think, is really what you talked a lot about, and that techniques such as explicit instruction, math flexibility, using visual aids, and continual ongoing feedback that's also very explicit and provided in different ways. So, not just individually, but with, you mentioned partners and small groups can really help students with dyscalculia. And the one of the big things, the big takeaways is that recognizing the characteristics of dyscalculia is critical so that we can adjust our teaching methods and also feel empowered to know our students and help them develop their confidence and competence in mathematics while providing them the tools and strategies they need to be successful in the classroom and outside of the classroom. And finally, one of the big themes that kind of came out today is that as educators, we have to continue growing our own knowledge so that we can refine our teaching practices so we can keep up with our kiddos, especially keeping at the forefront of our thinking the students who might be struggling with math and ensure that they're not left behind and they have a successful math journey in life so that they can become the kiddo who may have been struggling in 3rd grade to a large school district's math content leader. That it's just an amazing, um, your story is just absolutely amazing to me and so and inspiring.
Thank you.
I hope that all of the insights that Dr. Stephanie Evans has provided us today help you navigate your educational journey more clearly and confidently. If you are interested in growing your knowledge about dyscalculia, even more, you're in luck. As Stephanie mentioned earlier, that she has a blog that was published on the Compass PD website earlier this week, and it's titled Empowering Teachers to Support Students with Dyscalculia: Key Knowledge and Strategies. Be sure to check it out. Additionally, please feel free to share your thoughts and experiences. I'd love to hear from you, and I know Stephanie would love to hear from you as well, so that together we can continue to grow as educators and leaders. If you found today's episode valuable, consider sharing it with a colleague who might also benefit from this same message. Next week's podcast, Dr. Fowler and I will be exploring ways to support students with dyslexia in the secondary setting. We're going to be focusing on continuing the knowledge of dyslexia in honor of Dyslexia Awareness Month. And I tell you, it is a guaranteed fun time when you get myself and Dr. Fowler together. So be sure to stay tuned. Thank you for joining us on the Compass PD podcast.